All right, can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, it sounds okay. All right, awesome. Hey, there we go. All right. Hope everybody's having a good day today. I'm going to try to keep this to right about 20 minutes, maybe 21, give or take. I can talk about this stuff for hours, so I will try not to. But I want to leave time for any questions that you may have, and feel free to raise your hand, ask any questions as we're going through. So essentially what I want to talk to today, this morning, is some of the biggest issues we're finding in the security space in the API environment ecosystem, and talk about some of the biggest issues, the common themes that we're finding as we work with customers across the world. Most of our customer base is in the EMEA region. We're increasing our customer base in the US, and as we do so, we're collecting stories, we're collecting case studies, and learning from those things. And I want to share those learnings because none of us has the time to make all the mistakes ourselves. Rather, learn from the experience of others where we can. And then I'm going to introduce a couple of case studies that we're going to walk in through much more detail later this afternoon. So right after lunch, we've got a 50-minute workshop, and then we'll really dive into the details of some of the case studies. I just didn't have time in the 25-minute session to do that. So a little bit about me. Don't like talking about myself too much, but I'll manage. So I've been in InfoSec for 20 plus years. I'm a bit of a gray beard, right? So my company is young, but I am not. Started as a pen tester, and then if you were in the US in the early 2000s, you may remember Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002, the Full Auditor Employment Act of 2002, and there for a couple of years, the bottom more or less fell out of the pen testing market, and everybody's resources went to figuring out what SOX compliance meant. Big Five just went to the Big Four. They didn't want to go to the Big Three in terms of audit firms. So I decided I didn't want to travel to do IT audit work, and I joined a little company called AIG in 2004. So I was there for 11 years. I was the Chief Information Security Officer and Group BSO for everything consumer-facing. So everything consumer-facing in the AIG portfolio was under my remit. So 180 countries, 202 regulators, good times. So a bunch of AIG alumni left after the bailout, so you may have heard about that being in New York. And started a company called Athene. We went public in 2016, Thomson Reuters IPO of the year. Yay, got a shirt. I didn't get to ring the bell, but my boss did. Then I went to Texas Capital Bank right before the pandemic, which is an awesome time to make a move. So went to Texas Capital Bank, and then one thing that's not listed on here is worked with a local billionaire in Texas and built a fintech. And it was really in those last two roles, as CISO of Texas Capital Bank specifically, and in the fintech, which is called Glorify, we just launched, so born on the 4th of July, yay. I really got interested in the API security space, and especially in the digital bank for TCB and in the fintech. My whole lifeblood was APIs. We had 400 APIs and 3,000 endpoints before we wrote a single insurance policy or opened a single bank account. But when I'm talking to the guys that I'm working with to design the SOC, the Fusion Center, the fraud ops teams, and things like this, and I want to know, I'll get to threat modeling in a second, assets, actors, interfaces, and actions, who's doing what to what via what over my APIs, they're looking at me like I've got lobsters crawling out of my ears. They're like, nobody does this today. I'm like, how do you not do this? This is core to the bank. So anyway, one of the co-founders of TCB is an investor in Wib. He put me in touch with the guys, our co-founders, some of the leaders in the API security space, former CTO for Israel's National Cyber Directorate. He was there 27 years, PhD in machine learning, et cetera, and a lot of the top attackers. And what I learned from the guys, and at least one of them is in the room today, but I'll let him stay anonymous, is that they were exploiting API vulnerabilities and weaknesses as part of their offensive operations before the defenders even had a clue that these attack surfaces were open. And one of the things that I've been saying as a CISO for the last 2 decades is your defense should be informed by offense, right? That's why every year in Q1 and in April, we're all reading the Verizon reports, right? We're all talking to the pen test, like what's happening in the field that's with context around my industry, my vertical, my business, and that's what I wanted to share today. Your defense should be informed by the offense, so what are we actually seeing out there? And I want to talk about root cause. We tend to talk about, in technical terms, the symptom or the end result, but we rarely get all the way to root cause. So as a CISO, I'm in like a second line governance function. When you find an API that's exposed to the outside world, that's exposing your business logic and your back-end system, that's a problem, but that's not the problem. That's a symptom of something that failed upstream. change management, architecture. Somebody should have known that you were exposing this interface to the outside world before it actually shows up in the outside world. And that's, oh, do I need to stop moving around? Sorry, I do that, I pace. Got it. I'm getting corrective directions from the back. So that's a symptom, right? That's not the root cause. The root cause of the API security challenges I want to touch on just briefly is fundamentally when we change the architecture from a monolithic to a microservice-based architecture, we're changing the attack surface. And I speak to a lot of like boards of directors and regulators and folks that are non-technical. And the analogy I use in this space is if you think of the monolithic architecture as sort of a castle and a moat, right? A lot of internal services and the internal vendors selling things inside the castle and whatever. You got a couple guards, you got a moat, you got a portcullis and a drawbridge. You're good, right? You know your ingress points, you know your egress points. On the inside, everything can kind of trust each other. You're not coming into attack from the inside, and that's all fine. When you move to a microservice-based architecture, which everybody is doing for lots of good reasons we're moving away from monolithic. But all of those services that used to be inside the castle walls, now it's more like a strip mall or a shopping center with external doors on all the stores, right? And most security programs now still have one guy standing out front of the main entrance with a spear, like, and all the traffic's going on behind him, and they're like, no, our security, we have detected 100% of attacks coming in through this main entrance. Yeah, well, that's awesome, that's great. What about this other stuff behind you, right? And it's just simply blind spots. They don't know the attack surface. And so fundamentally, the way that, I'm sorry, I was going to pace again. Fundamentally, when the attack surface changes, the architecture changes. You change what's exposed to the outside world. And APIs, by design, this is not a bug, this is a feature, they expose business logic and application logic directly, right? And the tooling that we used for the last 20 years in the web application security space, WAFs and now API gateways, they were never built to understand your business logic, right? I don't care what vendor tells you what hype about AI or whatever. Fundamentally, computers are as dumb as hoe handles. They follow instructions really well, but your WAF does not understand your business logic. It can't. And evaluating your WAF by its ability to do that is like evaluating a fish by its ability to ride a bicycle. It was never designed to do that, right? And so when you expose that logic directly, now you're giving attackers ways to leverage and exploit that logic. And specifically, I'm going to go into a classic example of a logic-based attack in this session and then in more detail later this afternoon, that we went straight through the WAF. We went straight through the API gateway and exploited the business logic, and nobody saw it at all. And I'll talk about how we could have detected it and why this is what we're working on. And so the attacks are different, right? The attacks are against business logic, and they tend to be chained. We still see injection. We still see cross-site scripting and SQL injection. Those are still things. But the ones that we're most worried about, the more difficult ones to address, are things like broken object level authorization, broken function level authorization, right? So I can access something I shouldn't be able to. I can do something I shouldn't be able to. Mass assignment, like the PayPal issue from a couple years ago, where you could submit is admin equals true, or MFA is enabled equals false as part of your HTTP request. Like, that's a problem. And these things are much harder to deal with the traditional defenses. And so our defenses need to be different, right? So going back to that core principle, your defense must be informed by the offense. Otherwise, you're always fighting the last war. And defenders are always fighting the last war. In this case, APIs, working with a partner of ours, Akamai, they gave us a recent stat. 91% of internet traffic right now is API traffic. If you had asked me 10 years ago, what's going to be 91% of web traffic in 2022? I said, I don't know, probably phishing or porn. I no idea. But yeah, 91% is API traffic, and 50% of APIs are unmanaged. That is a dangerous combination. So APIs have circled the world while security's still getting their boots on, right? And that's what we're helping to solve for. So specifically, there are differences. When we talk about the differences in API security, we've been all using this OWASP top 10 list for the last 19 years, almost 20 years, right? And we're familiar with these things. And number 4 goes to number 6, and number 7 goes to number 5, and we see this every year, right? And this is a valuable list. And unfortunately, with love to all of my developer colleagues here, we still aren't doing this well. We're still releasing code that's vulnerable to these things. But this is sort of the last war. WAFs are actually pretty good at this stuff. And there's only one of these that really carries over purely from the OWASP top 10 to the API top 10. So OWASP started actually at the insistence and pushing of some of the folks that I work with. published a list starting in 2019 of the API top 10. And this is really where things like BOLA, which is the number one, broken function level authorization, mass assignment, so forth. This is where the logic-based attacks come in. And the big rule is, like, rules-based systems can't defend against logic-based attacks. They can't. It's just not possible. They're not that smart. And so a lot of CISOs that I talk to, they really aren't, there's kind of a continuum of CISOs that I talk to, you know, so sort of as peers, right? These are the folks that I've known for 2 decades. And they either say, well, I don't know, I've got a WAF, and, you know, WAF is a layer 7 device, and HTTP, you know, APIs speak HTTP, the WAF understands HTTP, so I'm covered, right? And I was like, well, no, let's talk a little bit more about this. And then the other side are the folks that are a little bit further along, like a Fortune 30 CIO or CISO that I had lunch with a few weeks ago. And he's like, no, dude, I get this. I've been looking into this. I understand what BOLA is. I understand that. Here's my problem as a Fortune 30 company. I've got 140,000 APIs that I know of in healthcare, sending patient data, billing information, credit cards from hospitals to mobile devices, to clinics, to collection agencies, to people's phones, to doctors' offices. How do I get my arms around that? And then he said, which is the quote that stuck with me, this is why daddy drinks. Like, how do I get my arms around that? And so fundamentally, what we're going to talk about is, how do you get your arms around that? What are the main problems companies need to address, and how do we solve them? So all of our updates in our slides and in our actual deliverables to customers have 3 parts. What, so what, now what? We just finished the what. Now we're going to go into the so what. What are the main problems that companies need to address? There's really 4 things I boiled it down to. First is visibility. If you are familiar with the frameworks like NIST, the critical security controls, you can't secure what you can't manage, or what you can't see, you can't manage what you can't see, and fundamentally, I'll tell you, as a CISO in large enterprise organizations where we did all the stuff with the second line of defense under the Enterprise Risk Management Office, and you have a risk register, and you write down all of your risks, and you make your business executives sign off that they accept the risk and all these things, it's never something on your risk register that bites you. It's always a blind spot, right? That's interesting, and it's interesting to have a catalog of your risks. And fundamentally, there's only 4 risk treatments in the operational risk management space: accept, mitigate, transfer, or avoid. But it's always a blind spot. It's always, true example, finding a server in Nyack, New York that's beaconing out malware and has been for the last 18 months that nobody was monitoring. Like, it's always stuff like that. It's always a blind spot. So 50% of APIs are unmanaged, give or take. That varies a lot by customer. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. But fundamentally, that's the core problem. The second problem is, once you find it, who do I assign this to? So a previous employer that I mentioned earlier, but you know, for the sake of anonymity, fake anonymity now, we'll call it BIG. In 2014, like everybody else in the real world, we did not have a continuously automated, 24/7, always up to date with owners assigned CMDB. It sounds great. ServiceNow will sell the heck out of that all day long. In reality, we had 2,000 data centers and LAN rooms all across the world. And so we started scanning ourselves for Heartbleed, right? It's 2014. Heartbleed comes out. Now we're doing bugs with logos and sayings now. I don't know when we started doing that, but okay. So that's Heartbleed. We start scanning ourselves like a third party, and we found thousands of vulnerable OpenSSL libraries. Now what? Congratulations. Now you got a list of problems. Who do I assign this to? This is a middleware thing? Does this go to server ops? What business unit is this server associated with? What application runs here? How important is this, right? So that context of you found something, now who to assign it to, we see that a lot. And fundamentally, part of our multi-lens approach helps to solve for that. Third is tooling for logic-based attacks. WAFs and API gateways serve their purpose, and they're good at what they were designed to do. They suck at what they were not designed to do. That's not a knock on WAFs. They weren't designed to do that, right? My truck, I have an F-350 because I live in Texas and I have cows. My truck is great at hauling things and pulling things. It sucks at wheelies and agile, nimble moves on curvy roads. My motorcycle is great for that. My motorcycle sucks for hauling cows behind it. It was never designed to do these things, right? That's not an indictment, it's just a fact. And then once you get caught up, you have to stay caught up. Management of API velocity. Very common problem is customers that are either worried about security, so it's slowing them down, or security just can't keep up. And sometimes security is still operating in the once a quarter we do a manual pen test release process type thing. That doesn't work in an agile microservice world at all. So we got to give them the tooling and the capabilities and the process knowledge to stay caught up. And getting your arms around it, I go back to old school threat modeling. You know, I'm kind of a graybeard. I mentioned it earlier, right? I need to know assets, actors, interfaces, and actions. Who's doing what to what via what, and it all starts with visibility. And to do threat modeling, it doesn't matter what model you use. You can use Stride, you can use Dread, you can use Pasta, you can use MITRE. It doesn't matter the acronym. I use Stride because I'm familiar with it and it works. But when you get your assets, actors, interfaces, and actions, and depending on where you are in the hype cycle versus drinking the Kool-Aid of zero trust, that modifies where your trust borders are. You don't trust anything, cool, that's fine. But at these trust borders, you look and see what actors can do and how they can perpetuate attacks such as STRIDE stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of access, and escalation of privilege. STRIDE, right? So how can this actor perform these type of attacks against this asset? And if you're not monitoring your APIs, you don't have any idea about the types of attacks that they're capable of carrying out, like what the vulnerabilities are in the code, or what attacks are actually taking place in the production traffic. And unless you simulate attacks to validate what you're actually vulnerable to, you wind up escalating issues that look like problems, but that actually aren't, and waste time. You waste your developers' time, you waste your security operations team time, right? So fundamentally, we're working with a major car manufacturer now, and they're talking about stuff that's even blowing my mind. Like, so we're used to thinking about APIs in the north, south, east, west context, and now we're talking about APIs between cars and street lights and traffic lights in the next 5 years. Right? Internet, the connected cities and things like that. And as the CTO, I'm like, wow, okay. So how are we going to get our arms around that one? It's an interesting, threat landscape. But this has gotten away from security teams. They don't understand who's doing what to what via these APIs. And when adoption outpaces security, obviously the results are predictable, right? If you're lucky, it's going to be this last one, which is Coinbase. Did you guys see the Coinbase issue from a couple of months ago? This was fascinating. You could exchange any quantity of a particular cryptocurrency for the same token number of tokens of any other cryptocurrency. So you take your, 50 Dogecoins or Shibas or whatever and exchange it for 50 Bitcoin. They got lucky, as a lot of us do, and a security researcher brought that up to them, and it cost them a $250,000 bug bounty. But they called this a market nuking vulnerability, right? That's not the news press hype. That would have, like, if somebody had found that in advance, that would have been really, really bad. And I'm not throwing shade at these guys. I've been a defender for too long. There but for the grace go I, right? This can happen to any of us when adoption outpaces security, but the reality is the world isn't slowing down for our security teams. So, case study that we're going to go through later on today was with a major bank. It is not an American bank, but by asset size, which is how banks sort of rate each other, it would be in the top 100 of U.S. banks. So give or take $90 to $100 billion in assets. With a live account, our attack simulation found vulnerabilities that our researchers then was able to parlay into this vulnerability plus this vulnerability equals a more severe issue. And the activity was not detected. I used to run fraud. I used to run security operations for big banks. I knew the answer when I asked, did you see us? No, they didn't. And postmortem analysis showed about $10 million in losses for this specific attack before potential discovery. And I'm going to talk more about that specifically this afternoon. But fundamentally, they were depending on, like a lot of companies do, browser orchestration and front-end logic to enforce controls, right? That's how the queries, that's how the requests are going to the back-end systems. Well, if you depend on people to come in through your front door, and that's where you have your guard and your badge reader and all those things, and you've got the smoker's door propped open on the side over here with an ashtray in front of it, attackers are going to use whatever entryway they can, not the one that you want them to use. So all we did was we crafted the queries directly, and the part in the query that enforced the minimum conversion amounts for FX conversions, currency conversions, we just left that part out. The part that enforced the fees, we just left that part out. There was no rate limiting because this is a fee-generating service. You know what banks like? Fees. They love fee income. So you want to do 100 conversions a day? Knock yourself out. I get 100 fees. Awesome. And then the logic always calculated the exchange rate to 6 digits past the decimal, but it always rounds it up to the hundredths place. So what if you're in dollars, it's pennies, and so we exploited those characteristics to execute a classic salami slicing attack, which, if you're familiar with salami slicing, like, it should sound familiar. That was the theme of Office Space and Superman 3. Like, that was 1983. Richard Pryor driving up in the new car. Like, we have known about this type of attack in banking for over 40 years. And this was at the time exposed live logic to the outside in a very large institution. And so because we rounded it up, we were shopping for interest rates. And actually one of the things that we found was the attack surface for this type of attack varies based on international exchange rates, because that impacts the rounding. And so as a defender, you mean my attack surface actually changes based on fluctuations in currencies? Who has this as part of their security program? Well, the answer to that is nobody. So you have to focus on other ways to detect it. But it's an interesting byproduct of which accounts and currencies are you targeting? Well, it depends. It depends on what you can exchange it for. So we were initially targeting dollars and euros, and then the dollar to euro went crazy, and we hit parity, and we're like, okay, we'll change that. I'll talk about more this afternoon. But what they said was, when would we have found this? It's been about $10 million mark. So what we learned is when you deplete all of the money in a particular currency exchange pair account, like you say it's a British pounds to Canadian dollars, or yen to shekels or whatever, that's when the bank performs a look-back analysis, because they have to go to the open market and buy more of that currency, just like everybody else does. So they have to go buy more yen. And then they do a manual look-back analysis to see if they got the fee income that they were expecting to get. And in this case, they would not have, because we aren't charging fees, because we're writing the queries. And then they would have known something was up. And so now as an attacker, I'm thinking, okay, just don't drain the account, or choose a bigger account, right? Internally, when you're transferring money around like this via the APIs and the business logic, it's like holding a slinky, and you're just sloshing it around. There's no money leaving, and primarily the exfil controls is where the operational controls are. So you can slosh this money around and take a little bit of piece out of the middle for a long, long time before they notice. And this is a classic example of a business logic attack. This is stuff that WAFs and API gateways were never designed to and can never understand. And so what we are doing at WIB is providing multiple lenses to show how we would have detected this and how we can protect against similar logic-based attacks that current tooling and current processes, even internal programs, wouldn't have caught. Pen testers don't look for this stuff. They don't know how. They don't understand the business logic, and that's a very, very sort of out of scope for a pen testing program. The change management program and the QA processes, they looked at the business logic through the browser. You look at it the way that and through the mobile app, right? It looks the way we wanted to do. I tried to submit a minimum amount. Yep, worked out fine, right? They didn't test the abuse cases and going into the smoker's door, right? They're going in the sideways. SecOps didn't see anything. They did see, actually, we hit them with the normal OWASP top 10 type attacks, and I'll actually show you a page from, it's actually a WAF company that says they do API security that we went straight through to actually get to the backend systems, but it shows like block SQL injection. Cool. So they're blocking the stuff they were designed to block. Awesome. Anyway, all these layers in modern banking, and this bank it's almost 100 years old. Security program is, in regulator speak, commensurate with the size and complexity of the institution, right? They're on their ball, but it was all blind spots they weren't aware of, right? And so in this and the other half a dozen case studies I'm going to go through this afternoon, the theme is APIs and their vulnerabilities were blind spots, and you can't manage what you can't see. You can't monitor what you can't see. So how do we close that? Now what? What do I do about this? 2-minute warning on the back as well. So the way that we have to approach this is with as many lenses as possible. I know the way the industry started. We've got folks on our team that worked with the first companies, and including some of the very first developers and engineers, pioneers in this space, that were attacking APIs as part of their offensive operations. And you can get a lot of information just from traffic. However, you can't see all of this from traffic. So to use a restaurant analogy, I like to use analogies, especially in non-technical crowds. I know this is a more technical group. But if you think of looking at your traffic as a proxy of what's going on in your restaurant, that's basically standing in front of the kitchen and seeing what gets ordered and what goes out of the kitchen, right? Looking in code, a lot of firms are just looking in code, and that'll tell you your ingredients list and what you have in the kitchen. It'll tell you the menu of things that you offer, but it doesn't tell you what's actually selling. We have to put these lenses together. And by putting these lenses together, we eliminate the problem of trying to sort of look at the night sky through a drinking straw, which is how you do it when you only have one lens. And we apply context such that, like when we see vulnerabilities in code, real example that I'll go into more this afternoon, we see vulnerabilities in code, then we apply insight and context that we look at through traffic and understand business value, and then things that look suspicious, we actually simulate attacks against to validate, was this really BOLA, or does this just look like BOLA, right? Because the last thing you want to do as a security practitioner is start spraying your devs with false positives. As soon as you do that, they've already got enough to do. As soon as you do that, they're not going to work on your stuff. You're wasting their time. Nobody has enough resources to do it that way. And what we find is we find vulnerabilities in code, for example, 5 versions of the same API that are running, but you're only getting traffic to one of them. You don't have to issue 10 tickets to close these things. Shut these 4 down. Save yourself the effort. 80% of your attack surface is gone, 80% of your work is gone. Fix it once, and then build your baseline for what normal looks like off of there. And that is what we do. I ran 2 minutes longer than I meant to. I just hit 0 on the timer. Do I have time for questions or no? You guys
we got time for one question. Somebody got a question? Must have a question after that. Okay, well, I actually have one then to start.
Please.
So in particular, you mentioned the whole notion of there's some future where our vehicles are talking to streetlights or vice versa. So all of a sudden, the surface becomes very, very different, right?
Yeah.
It is truly the mall where everyone has a door, right? So how can we start to, as designers, as implementers, how can we start to think ahead a little bit to be prepared for that kind of situation? What are the things that we should be paying attention to now once those cars get on the road?
It's a great question. And fundamentally, it goes back to design and engineering of the APIs and the interfaces, right? And one thing that pains me as a practitioner that I'm really encouraging our customers and trying not to replicate is when we give our customers issues and ask them what to remediate, I know everybody wants an easy button. Everybody wants can you just block all this stuff for me? But the reality is you need to fix your code. And we need to teach developers how to fix their code, right? Because when you're exposing the business logic directly, it's very, very difficult to shim something in front of it. And when you do, even when you do, you make your environment more complex. What WAFs have allowed customers and developers to do for the last 20 years is essentially write bad code and then put your 98-pound weakling in a bulletproof limo so you don't have to fix the code issues anymore, right? So you have tremendously vulnerable applications that are sitting in what they think is a bulletproof limo, but in reality, your APIs have the windows rolled down, right? So fundamentally, it comes back to engineering and fixing the code and teaching people how to write better code. That's very hard to do, but that's the only way we can really address it long term.
Yep. And just as a follow-up, that's why the logic-based elements, there are a whole bunch of exposures that you can only work out through, you can't work out through simple rules, right? You have to actually work it out.
Exactly. And so like we can create, I'll give you one example and then I'll yield. We can create a shim for a WAF or something like that, right? And so the analogy I use there is if somebody kicks a football or a soccer ball through your window and it's gonna rain that afternoon, sure. We'll help you create a WAF rule and you can put a plastic trash bag over your window. But fundamentally, please fix your code. Because in 6 months, you're just gonna have a house full of broken windows with garbage bags taped up. Right? And complexity fundamentally is the enemy of security, right? If you don't expose the attack surface in the first place, if you keep your APIs simple, if you keep your logic easy to understand and well documented, you don't have an attack, you don't have anything to take advantage of, right? And it's optimistic maybe, but increasing complexity by layering on stuff doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. It makes it harder.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely.